Hello everyone, today we talk about the English Field Army strength of the Hundred Years' War. We rarely do this, but it's important to look at organics and or just the size of armies to understand much about them. Sometimes medieval warfare is taught without, even referring at a point to the importance of quantities, of numbers. For example, the English armies of the Hundred Years' War, just mathematically in history, are the ones that achieved the greatest amount of victories in the entire military history. In condition of symmetry with the French, that were culturally homogeneous, materially, technologically, etc. In conditions of inferiority, given that numerically inferior ratio compared to the French makes the English armies of Edward III literally the strongest in history for this specific reason. This is not a debatable thing. It's not my opinion. It's just pure maths, right? Then you can make other considerations, but we will explain also at some point the English tactics of the Hundred Years' War, which is actually a much more complicated thing that you imagine, and because it has to do with numbers as well sometimes, and the numbers, of course, of the armies in absolute terms, but also the composition of the same, so the arms ratios and so on. And it's not the simple story that I've told you, right? And there is first of all, a premise we could make about the properly the information and the sources from which we derive them regarding such field army strength. Not just for the English army, in this case, the Hundred Years' War, but more in general. There is a massive prejudice, especially in the Anglosphere, historiographically speaking, against the reliability of chronicles. And this is a very old thing that has been debated recently because objectively, the more we read chronicles from medieval times, the more we realize that their informations are often actually very accurate, right? And precision is not accuracy, but in general, the genre per se of the chronicle is actually the sap of medieval history in the first place, right? Most medieval history is based on chronicles, and I personally been working with lots of chronicles of another area of Europe, but still one where also we haven't, and perhaps exactly because of this reason, because of course there are cultural differences as well that weigh, right? There are chronicles and chronicles, because there are countries and countries, there are historians and cultures in general, but where we have, for example, developed a completely different attitude towards chronicles. And I have even demonstrated, given that a 150 pages chapter of my PhD thesis was dedicated exclusively to the count of numbers from chronicles with tens of thousands of quotes, exactly to demonstrate, as I did, that those figures were actually correct from just a statistical point of view, because I brought in something like 50, 60 different chronicles, and all the information that they give you repeatedly about these numbers that are evidently important, if anything, because they are given, are very spot on, very precise. And if you compare them all together, so all chronicles coming from a wide region and in theory with nothing in common with each other except the topic that we're discussing, actually give not just basically the same numbers about armies and more or less agree fundamentally on the size, etc., but they also all together, which is would be just in terms of statistically unlikely if it were just random numbers of something like that, they actually document the same changes, the same trends properly in the organics change, the numerical, the field army strength in general of the entire region in the same direction. That is to say, there is not a single chronicle of these from which you actually derive, say, I don't know, the idea that at the end of that period, for example, there wasn't a shrinking of the dimension of armies, which is something that, given that it was also about the 14th century, we will partly address. It happens also for the English, in a way. they all say the same things. They all even pinpoint certain specific years as a moment of greater, even in the composition of the armies. You have a definite change in the composition, in the ratio of cavalry and infantry, that is always the same. They were all chronicles that do not explicitate that, but simply give the numbers that for you to draw the, to analyze and to draw conclusions on, basically picture the same thing. So I'm quite proud of that work, because it actually demonstrates that chronicles are not particularly reliable, but altogether are basically and kind of obviously saying the real deal. And denying that is a very posh way to say, yeah, no, I'm better because I'm modern. This is a mentality and an attitude that is very present in certain cultures that give more importance to scholarship than to sources, right? And committing, in fact, also some of the most atrocious and kind of insular-minded mistakes regarding not just those sources, but properly medieval warfare altogether. Last year I made a video called "Did We Get Medieval Warfare Right?", in which I explain that at this point, and I'm modestly pioneering the field at this point, that there is a massive misunderstanding about properly the dimensions, not just of medieval warfare, but also properly medieval civilization, because of a tendentious historiography that has, let's say, kind of monopolized the scene and kind of unaddressed certain issues and problems, and also a broader academic decline that hasn't really produced too much in terms of, especially of analytic content, as opposed to a merely descriptive one, and that hasn't properly taken notice of these issues. And now, when looking at the 100 Years' War, we are, first of all, as we were saying before, looking at a condition of English numeric inferiority over the French on a regular basis. Part of the reason being that England was more compact and smaller, and also quite politically peculiar kingdom, and France being a giant composed of many different countries actually within the same, that was suffering at that point political crisis that can be framed in the broader one of the 14th century, and that the English profited of by essentially making leverage on the most fragile joints, if we can say like this, and essentially pursuing a successful strategy during the war. The fact they lost in the end has not really anything to do with a particular mistake in approach. It's another typical mistake to blame people of the past, as if, today we would have been more capable or knowledgeable than them about their warfare, etc. Hence also the prejudices towards, for example, the effectiveness of the French military in the same period, and this impression that there would be, massive also qualitative technical differences that would make, in fact, the result, especially during the 100 Years' War, which is, instead much more heavenly balanced, also on the battlefields, than what we normally think, and the English and French armies were actually much more similar in composition and tactics than we think conceptually, right? Even though, yes, there were important macroscopic differences, or at least some that were counterbalancing each other, right? And thus, even in the different style, still being much closer, again, in terms of cultural homogeneity than we think. And which is what actually makes the English victories and especially their repetition, their seriality, even more astonishing and more praisable, because again they stemmed from actually a pretty leveled background instead. And the field army strength is also eye-opening, I would say, on the relatively small scale military involvement that we see. England was, as we've seen, was just smaller, right? It could afford through an enlightened leadership, especially the state that was founded by Edward III and his military reforms, but really what really stood behind them from a political and social point of view, that could afford to do something that is actually pretty convenient historically, is making war in somebody else's land, right? So essentially, continuing this English legacy of say exploiting the French resources were initially actually what made the Kingdom of England in the first place. Before, in the 13th century, the Capetians ousted the English of the French territory, and in this sense, paying off the initiative, the activity, the ambitions of the English nobility through the ravaging of France, right? And there were different strategies employed during the war. 14th century, yes, is different from the 15th, in part also because of the, as you know, there were some different phases throughout this. The most intense were before in the mid 14th fundamentally, and in the early 15th, and war was changing. Also, armies were changing, etc. But as we'll see from the English side, actually the army size didn't change much, differently from the French one. And there we have, as we were saying before, to understand the swings of the broader European civilization. Why were there kind of smaller armies at some point, what they were made of, etc. So these are things that we haven't discussed, but we will hopefully do it at some point. The idea is that the English were kind of perfectioning their military instrument to be functional to the French theater, through their unity of command, the monarchic control, and the exploiting the general weaknesses of the French giant that, as often occurs, in fact, military history is, as Goliath, not really the strongest, right? Very often the smaller power, as David manages to exploit the enormous also force and organizational, logistical, in fact, difficulties of the giant. The largest English armies of the war were usually commanded by the king or the Prince of Wales, which again shows this important political institutional control on the national armies. Edward III, in what was probably the war's largest concentration of English troops, gathered more than 20,000 men to besiege Calais, right? That constitute basically probably the largest army at the time. There was, at the siege of Calais, between 1346 1347, so this is the end of the Calais campaign, right? There were constantly something between 5 to up to 30,000 men in different times. Naturally, armies tended to deplete themselves along the campaign, and reinforcements would arrive. These were quite composite armies, as we will see now. In fact, of this between 5,000, 30,000 soldiers at different times, and we have a pretty precise section of the same. Up to 20,000 were Flemish allies, right, and up to 24,000 were sailors of the supporting fleet, apparently. And so we're talking about something that was not specifically the English army as you would think. But everything makes, in war, especially in those situations, besieging Calais was important, was a garrison of 1,800 men that was still relevant for considering what were the resistance capacities of fortresses at the time. And we are lucky enough to have the king's household accounts preserved, so that we actually have an accurate breaking down of these precisely 32,303 men, made up like this. So the Prince of Wales, numbering 1, right? The Earls, including the Spencer as Earl of Gloucester, counting 10. The Bishop of Durham, another single. 2 German counts. Then 78 among barons and bannerets. So the bannerets, as you know, are basically knights that had their own retinue and banner, in fact, and therefore being counted individually here, not just with their retinue. 1,066 knights and 4,182 squires, men-at-arms, and banner bearers. These, the ones that we have listed, are the entire cavalry force that counts for 5,340 men. Speaking of the infantry, we have 52 centenars, 794 centenars, so these are NCOs practically. Then hobbilars that are normally considered as light cavalry but could serve on foot as well, in number of 528. 4,025 mounted archers, 16,051 foot archers. And consider this especially under the light of the English tactics, right? And noticing immediately something crucial, that the archers were in dramatic larger numbers than the knights that scored their victories mostly on foot, as you know, in the English case. And this speaks also of the kind of diluting the individual power of the longbow per se, right? And noticing this disproportion basically with any other European army of the time, especially in the West, with properly the ratio of the amount of archers over the one of knights, right? Then we have 140 kings' household yeomen, so kind of the royal bodyguard. Then what in English are called pensioners, being in this case German infantry named after their male corselets. So it would come from Panzer, gepanzert means armored, right? And in fact similar troops occur elsewhere as armati, which in Latin indicates not the fact of being armed, but rather being heavily armored, right, in Middle Latin. The pensioners are in number of 339. Then 111 crossbowmen, 6 standard bearers, 6 armorers, and 339 artificers, meaning masons, carpenters, engineers, etc., plus artillerists, including 12 gunners. Which is quite interesting because altogether, or an army of essentially more than 30,000 men, it was essentially the largest that you find in Europe, right? This is the standard, right? In Europe, where an entire kingdom mobilized on an equivalent force, etc., it was 30,000, right? So this was the compromise also for properly the logistical capacities, of technological logistical capacities of the time, of keeping an army tactically and strategically functional on the field, right? They could even bring 100,000 men, but you never find them because they would have not made up an effective fighting force, right? And consider this is the largest army of the entire war that the English ever fielded. So nothing basically coming closer to 30,000, which is already per se, considering the intensity of the 100 Years' War that dragged on, like it's not that it was particularly long per se, it was even longer than 100 years. And as you know, there were actually kind of 3 different wars with some peace in between, but like the number of expeditions that was pretty intense, right? Didn't ever bring to what would have been an average 30,000 man army at that point. This may be clearer in the sense that here we are already in the mid 14th century, right? And so most of the war was fought afterwards, and so the crisis that struck Eurasia did bring to the shrinking of armies, right? Especially in the increase of men-at-arms, most of the cases, and the dilution, especially of the infantry, the dilution of the properly of the of the commoners' presence. England made a bit of a difference, as we've seen with the archers, because these were kind of more professional, right? Part of the reason where we are also relatively well documented about not excessively telling the truth, but what we can't be more spot on is because we have some indenture contracts preserved, right? So a bit like the condotta that we have, showing what was the initial army strength, or at least the initial indenture strength. So not necessarily what even would be on the field, which is a completely different thing, and for which you must rely exclusively on the chronicles, because those are the only sources telling you how effectively armies fought. That's why I didn't say even at the beginning, but that's the single most important thing. But how do you know about war in general in the Middle Ages? Without chronicles, you can't basically study anything. You can't study tactics, because there is no other source explaining that, unless there is a letter every once in a while, but the chronicles are disproportionately more numerous and quantitative, properly informed, and strategy as well, through the saying. So, as we'll see, most of the times, the same initial numbers were pretty reduced, and you could imagine them being reduced during the war as well. While it is true that there were this kind of allies and sometimes also just locals, I mean, think even about the wars between the Armagnac and the Bourguignon, but in that case was kind of a bigger, almost quasi-statal thing at the end of the day. But let's say in general, murderers, just people gathering because they wanted to loot, right, was pretty normal, right? So that's also when we read larger numbers than the usual, as we'll see now, and say, this source says that there were, that there is a variety in some thousands, but because maybe it's not because the chronicle is so inaccurate, but because there were objectively lots of people following the army, in the form even just of think about the saddler train, think about the merchants, right? Most of this army didn't quite bring the loot all in, right? They sold it immediately because also it was pretty burdensome from a logistical point of view. So the merchants paid in money, which were much more practical to handle and to bring with you, and that was it. Right, so one should read beyond, right? So being also aware of what it meant to even just keep an army on the field functionally and also properly, and most, like in this case, in a foreign land, largely. But coming back to our list, what is fascinating, in fact, exactly about this, that you find only 6 armorers and 12 gunners, over 239 men. So, of course, at this point, kind of uniforms, kind of a standardized equipment as such did not quite exist, but it's not even the point. There are some, I made a video last year about kind of the medieval standardization even of uniforms. There are some examples actually in the same English army during the 100 Years' War, but they were, it's just because they are documented for the first time, but it would have been normal for also for the prior Middle Ages by a certain degree. In any case, the conditions in which these armies versed normally was pitiful, right? There is all a literature about this. I mean, it was always everything was under stress, under terrible shortage of means, of this, very high constant rates of desertions, of deaths by illness, and logistical sanitary issues that were by far more important altogether than even being properly equipped, in a sense. And we could digress on this, but it's not at least today's video, but just for saying that it was much more important to make the army move. Here you realize from the number of artificers that is practically more than 50 times the one of armorers banally. Then there is an important amount of Welsh infantry, numbering in 4,572, including Welsh officers, knights, squires, the so-called ductores, the centenaries, and the vingtenaries. And this was the Welsh contingent. I made a video last year about Welsh infantry, I think during the 13th century, not this period, but largely Welsh warfare remained unchanged from there. So you can look at that if you're interested, but I will keep talking about Welsh warfare at some point. That were brought in, as you know, as regular allies. Also many troops that were hired in the army to indenture with the king, etc., would be even foreigners, but there would be lots of Welsh, as you know. The myth that the Welsh were greater archers than the English and that they taught them how to use longbows, etc., it's all a myth. It has completely no kind of any single trace of foundation whatsoever, historically speaking. The Welsh were nor better nor worse than any other British archer, and I discussed this elsewhere in some videos about English warfare, if I'm not wrong, about the English infantry during of the 13th century. But if anything, there were so many in the English army because they were cheaper. And this also tells something, especially in the 13th century, where this is documented. The English archers were even paid more, and that means something also because there were famous areas, especially the most forested one, for which the local English communities were famous for archery, and properly as longbowmen, that again were bows, just a larger size, nothing special. Bows were identical everywhere in Western Europe. Some of the English ones were produced in northern Italy and imported, etc. So it's just a mythology that derives from the bias spread from prior sources and just the poor interpretation of historiography. But this is today well established, right? That the reason why there were more Welsh troops were mostly economical rather than any greater or lesser technical skill. In any case, what made the skill was the profession and serving abroad, right? So that is the thing. Edward III had an army of about 10,000 men during the Thiers campaign, right? Although more than half of these troops were supplied by members of the king's anti-French coalition as well, so the external aid was quite important. At Calais, Edward had commanded about 10,000 men, the largest English deployment against France after the siege of Calais in the 14th century in absolute terms was the campaign of 1359-1360 under Edward III, the Black Prince and Henry of Grosmont, Duke of Lancaster. Telling the truth, there is also an aborted expedition of the same Edward III in 1372, but that in fact never started practically. But the 1359-1360 campaign, the Rheims campaign, saw an important participation of 12,000 men, so even not much higher than 10,000-11,000, so very far from the 30,000, 32,000 that we have witnessed at Calais. And Chandos Herald says just more than 10,000 men, which is what historiography has settled to 12,000, right? Albeit there are other sources, such as Jean Lebel and Froissart, saying that the troops of Edward III and Black Prince, so excluding even the ones of Henry of Grosmont, totaled, respectively, according to the two authors, 18,500, 16,000 men, right? Henrik Knighton says that 1,500 were foreign auxiliaries, described by the same Froissart, that, however, doesn't doesn't specify how many these were, just the nationalities as Germans, Bohemians, Brabançons, Flemings, and Hainaulters under Sir Walter Manny. Right, and this expedition was actually also a pretty long one, between October and 1359 and April 1360. It was an attempt to force the French to conclude peace on English terms. And this is it, right? You have 32,000 at Calais, then the siege of Calais, by the way. So also an important concentration of forces, and the English had taken the field against the French, or at least they had been forced to fight, which is also a leitmotif actually of the 100 Years' War that partly explains also the tactics that the English used in that condition of numerical inferiority. And then these, essentially, some say this higher numbers, even up to more than 18,000, but actually, and very likely also for the men who took the field up to Rheims, and considering the desertions, etc., probably 12,000 or even less, right? So this is the maximum size, right? And it's impressive because otherwise during the 14th century English armies were normally 5,000-6,000 or even less normally. This is understood also by certain strategic needs, right? Some noblemen were properly granted the monarchy the permission to launch expeditions, and they would kind of find alone their options again where they could strike. It was kind of easier for the English at that point to hit where the French were more were softer, were declining and having more trouble. We have Henry of Grosmont with 2,000 men only for his Gascon expedition of 1345, and 900 men at arms, including 100 Normans, by the way, and 1,300 archers for his chevauchée of 1355. In the same year, also the Black Prince sailed from England with only 1,000 men at arms, 1,000 mounted archers, and 600 on foot. And the 6,000 army that the same Black Prince led at Poitiers, counting 6,000 is exceptional in size, again for the English standards of the 100 Years' War. This 6,000 had no more than 3,000 men at arms. Baker says 4,000 anyway, 2,000 archers and 1,000 other infantry, a large proportion of the whole army being Gascon, not English, by the way. Famous chevauchée of important size in this regard were the ones of Knowles in 1370, which involved 2,000 men at arms and 2,000 archers, albeit Froissart says that they were 1,500 and 4,000 respectively. This expedition managed to raid a wide arc across northern France, but the King Charles V adopted a Fabian strategy, refusing to give battle, and in autumn the quarreling English commanders split up. Knowles managed to reach the safety of his fortresses in Brittany, but the force under Sir Thomas Grandison was defeated decisively by Du Guesclin at Pont-Valin near Le Mans on December the 4th. So it was an important failure. The other expedition is the largest and longest English chevauchée of the 100 Years' War, the 5-month campaign led by John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, in 1373, which counted perhaps 3,000 men at arms and 8,000 archers. Chroniclers say also 10,000, 15,000. Probably there's slightly higher figures, at least speaking of properly combat force. And this was considered as a failure in England because the Lancaster left Calais in August with this important force. Probably it was at its highest. In fact, considering that whole campaign, as we've seen, over half of the army was made up of archers. And instead of going towards Aquitaine, which was under increasing French pressure, the Duke moved south, ravaging Picardy, Champagne, Burgundy, and this was perhaps attempting to draw Charles V out of Paris. And the English chevauchés, as you know, were atrociously devastating. Right, they caused enormous damage on the provinces they entered, but the French forbade properly direct confrontation, and it urged the people to flee to the fortified towns. So in late autumn, John of Gaunt moved south through the Bourbonnais, also in the mountainous and lightly populated Auvergne, where Bertrand du Guesclin, the French constable we also mentioned before, carried out an effective guerrilla warfare against the English, and using essentially the same tactics that the French army had suffered of by the hand of Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. So also winter, practically the bad season, arrived with November, December, and the English situation was dire, as many horses and men died simply because of the atmospheric conditions. But in spite of Guesclin's attacks, the Duke of Lancaster moved almost to Bordeaux, becoming actually even bolder in strategically speaking in the process, so that the English army finally reached the Gascon capital at the beginning of January 1374, in spite of all these deprivations. And the ride is interesting because it covered almost 1,000 miles, and it managed to inflict an important damage to France throughout all the regions it crossed. It also helped to relieve French pressure on Brittany and on Aquitaine. But no pitched battles were fought, so this large army, for at least English standards, was essentially spent for just a minor objective after all, the broader strategic potential. And it costed a lot, right? The English, very often we think of them like winning that frequently, and therefore kind of being always, politically and strategically, at ease in a sense. But telling you the truth, the English army, had it suffered a major defeat in any of these circumstances, would have probably crumbled. Right, a defeat at Crécy, Poitiers, or Azincourt would have surely created, something like the War of the Roses, ante litteram, or even worse, telling the truth. And the fact that the Duke of Lancaster wasn't able to compensate for the high costs of the campaign brought him to some pressure, and the ensuing expeditions that were launched in 1375 and in 1380 were not successful, and by the latter year the English control of Aquitaine was severely reduced. And speaking of the 15th century, English armies didn't change very much in size because they had always been smaller, so they wouldn't shrink as much in comparison as their 14th century French ones, right, that were obliged to do so for many reasons, not much because they realized that greater numbers could make things more complicated, but also because France was, as you know, undergoing severe internal split, and it had already suffered systemically and structurally a lot from the same English strategy. But Henry V abandoned essentially the chevauchée for campaigns of siege and conquest that could provide England for more secure political and strategic gains. And this meant that many men were also invested in garrison duty, while others formed practically even smaller forces besieging various castles and strong points, at some point also risking, because of the limited size of their army, to be cut out from supply lines, be encircled, and so on. And in fact, for example, the 9,000 men Henry took to France in 1415 comprised one of the largest expeditions of the same 15th century, although the king had only about 6,000 with him at Azincourt. So, you realize that battle, also famously enough, was against overwhelming French, not just numerical, but overall superiority, and strikes for the clamorous success that the English achieved. Also consider that by the time of the battle, the English had probably only 900 men-at-arms and 5,000 archers. The largest encounters of this, among the largest English armies fielded, there were those at Verneuil in 1424, which was gathered from numerous garrisons, by the way, and led by John, Duke of Bedford. And the total seems to have been 10,000, perhaps. At least one source speaks of 1,800 men-at-arms and 8,000 archers. Another source claims 9,000 English-led forces in all. Then there was another English army serving in Normandy in 1417-18, and on sailing from England, this seems to have comprised originally some 2,221 men-at-arms and 7,794 archers, at the very least, that would be eventually reinforced by a further 500 men-at-arms and 1,500 archers. At the famous siege of Orléans, Thomas Montagu, Earl of Salisbury, commanded at the outset only some 3,467 men and 898 pages at the most, being a sizable English force at the time, whereas other forces were in fact smaller. Thomas, Duke of Clarence, led only about 1,500 men at Beaugé, while the English armies at Provence, Patay, Formigny, I made a video about the battle of Formigny, and Castillon, were all between about 3,000 and 5,000 men, right? And this can be explained in part also due to of course, the same shrinking, as we were saying before, is to be observed in the French armies of the time. In general, European warfare was becoming ever more professional, ever more armored, ever more explosive as well, which the French also have probably to be thankful for, because probably they would have kept suffering important defeats at the hands of the longbowmen if firepower, firearms had not properly not come to give a help as well. But that's not even the primary and surely not the decisive reason why the French won in the end. But the idea is that these times were the most heavily armored in the history of warfare in many ways. Like, you would see more metal around. That's that time in history, those battlefields. Professionalism, the compaction of states, and the possibility of properly affording more direct means of organizing saddle armies brought the monarchies, and surely the English and the French ones were working importantly in that direction. I made lots of videos and even made a playlist about the comparison of the English and French monarchy from a political institutional point of view, brought armies to be, say, in a sense smaller but more qualitative and more compact and more resourceful in a way. Actually, and this would be evidenced actually by the very end of and the consequences of the 100 Years' War. Major powers in Europe, as France would become after the war, while fundamentally England shrank to some sort of isolation that wouldn't break from, including some gap that had basically occurred with the continent, only by the with Cromwell, right, with the mid 17th century, would oblige, let's say armies to, on the continent especially, in fact, to become ever larger, right, and so increasing dramatically their organizational, logistical capacities, mostly to react to France, that was extending its power to become the hegemonic force in Europe, that eventually would achieve continentally only with Louis XIV. But if it hadn't been for the 100 Years' War, objectively, there would have not been another power like England to cripple significantly France the way it happened, right? The crisis was already there. The English were basically exploiting it. They weren't the main cause of it, but at the same time, that French potential had been halted. Eventually, Renaissance warfare stemmed from this extended statal capacities. Think about the French with their state, the Spanish with their colonial empire, in part also the empire itself, the Habsburgs, but a more gradual fashion would field ever larger forces, and so the 100 Years' War is also a bit the end of a type of medieval warfare, if you want, that in part the English again maintained, right? For example, the longbow was still a thing up to the mid 16th century in English armies, and up to that point even successfully so by a certain degree, even though the English armies were increasingly lagging behind compared to the continental developments, given that they also had to import a dramatic amount of properly of military advisors, artillerists, mercenaries from especially Flanders, Germany, etc. At that point to fill the gap. But the let's say still at this point, both England and France could make it, right? And as you know, the English had actually the greatest success in the latter phase of the 100 Years' War, before the siege of Orleans and the reversing of the tide, right? And at that point, as we were saying at the beginning, the English state had managed effectively to suck resources from France in order to maintain the system going on. And I made multiple videos about the Wars of the Roses, showing also famously as the reason of that very war, also dynastically, and was so kind of nobiliarly based, was part of the reaction of the English nobility to the loss of that habitual vacation sport, chevauchée, in France that they had normally relied on to satisfy their ambitions outside of their country. And this, structurally, systemically means that, all the mess they could have done in England, that, telling the truth, during the Wars of the Roses wasn't that big, because it was mostly, again, knocking single dynasts out and lineages out, not really ravaging the country like in France. But in perspective, we can say that great part also of the England that we know throughout even this shrinking, this kind of involution after the 100 Years' War, and the kind of the eclipse of English interference, at least largely, in continental affairs, like before, built up step after step. Of course, the later success of England due to this extraordinary ability deriving from English tactics and properly state building, especially since the refoundations of Edward III staying afloat and properly sedimenting, in fact, a political institutional continuity, that by the beginning of the 100 Years' War, we don't have to give for granted about England in its near future, like at least for the rest of the war. If it hadn't been properly for these victories that the English managed to score on the continent, and that the country somewhat benefited from, right? It could be very partial because still that there is a literature about how remunerative were actually wars at the time. It's a pretty silly question. Of course they were remunerative, right? And the fact that at the time the surplus was dramatically low was true from everywhere, from the basis of economics, of agricultural yields, but to wars themselves. So of course wars are unpredictable and you never know how they're going to end. These were gambles, but they were also the only ways they could actually achieve something. And I believe that England actually achieved a lot, not just by this extraordinary victories, just in terms of tactical development, etc. That was functional at the end of the day just for the 100 Years' War, because aside from the fact, yes, they fought, in fact, also a bit outside of France, also in the Iberian Peninsula, etc. And they were fighting also their clashes with the Celtic Fringe, etc. The English didn't go further, nor their tactical methods were actually copied by anyone. Right, there wasn't anyone fighting like the English during the 14th and 15th century abroad, even though fighting against the same English and even being able to produce weaponry for them or hiring them. And this is very instructive, in my opinion. But in the case of England, and especially because of its dramatic tactical scores, this was probably, in fact, the English way. What was the thing that the English kingdom needed to maintain its stability, to go through this actually pretty harsh times altogether for Europe, etc., and the crisis, and still managing to secure an important space in northwestern Europe that was effectively never to be challenged again, right? In a broader sense, as you know, nobody would manage to conquer England, to invade England. Yeah, okay, there was the Glorious Revolution, but that was more like a dynastic substitution. It was the same English actually ousting their government by, with Dutch support. But that those late medieval centuries are crucial for the final consolidation, in my opinion, of a system that managed to eventually go through further with all its difficulties, but still making it and eventually booming in the 18th century, late 17th, 18th century, and becoming the world power that we know with all its influence and so on. And as I was saying before, also there is a dramatic, in fact, influence that the Anglosphere had on the same ways we talk about medieval history, and that's why we hear about the 100 Years' War so often. At least I don't do it very much, because I tend to follow what I think to be a more complete picture and pattern to explain medieval warfare. But objectively, when you do look at that chapter, I don't think it's because the English managed to sell it better than other countries. It is because it's really significant. It is because there is something about it that probably also hasn't been fully explained in the properly, political and strategic way it would deserve. Because as I was saying before, I don't think the 100 Years' War has been paradoxically yet fully understood plainly from a military point of view, right? I believe that there is still much more to do, and showing, in fact, that especially the technologistic bias, the idea of the longbow, etc., is just a secondary aspect, right? It's about the success of what I'm sure British historiography has fully consolidated also at this time, but not it's at least the popular perception is still not the same one, and probably also a more comprehensive and in-depth study about the 100 Years' War battle altogether, we lack, right? And I can tell you because, again, I studied the same period. I studied partly the same. What is very important is the English military system in relation to the rest of Western Europe, which is often overlooked. And it's objectively very, very rare and difficult, and I wouldn't even know how to point it to you, like to a scholar who studied in actual detail the entire sources of all the battles of the 100 Years' War. And without that diachronic comparative way, you will always have just a partial picture of the wall. And I think that we can still do better and a lot, and I think this is a very interesting field of research that many young historians can surely commit their effort to. We will keep talking about 300 Years' War, hopefully soon, because it's really a massive chapter. It just, kind of scratched the surface of it on Schwerpunkt, but I created a playlist also about that, and especially from a military point of view. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.